Hello and welcome to Revisiting Madmen. In this episode we're going to analyse Season 1 Episode 5. But before we get into that, I want to mention that the format of this podcast has changed now. Instead of giving a scene by scene recap, I'm really only going to talk about what I think is pertinent to the story and to my analysis. So there will be a lot of omission, the episodes will be shorter, but overall I think we're making a better podcast this way. Okay, that's all, let's get into this episode. Thanks for listening folks, I hope you enjoy. Season 1, Episode 5 of Mad Men. This episode is titled 5G. It was written by Matthew Weiner himself and directed by Leslie Linker Glatter. It opens with Don and Betty coming home from this award ceremony where Don and Roger Sterling have won a Nuki Award. And until the traffic meeting much later on in the episode, the Nuki Award isn't brought up too much. We see Don obviously being congratulated by his colleagues in the office, but we learn the true reason of this award ceremony from the writer's perspective in the traffic meeting when Don is sitting with all of his colleagues around the table and is actually in quite a jovial mood here. When Peggy comes in, gives Don the note and says, this man's here to see you. He says his name's Adam Whitman, and Don's face turns as pale as a ghost here. He looks like he's gonna faint, as he usually does when his past is brought up. There are a few times in future episodes where there's some close calls with Don and his past identity being brought up, and this is usually how he reacts. It's just real fear, really, and he turns pale. He always looks like he's gonna faint. He looks like he's having a breakdown. And he actually looks like he's basically on the verge of running again when he's put in that position. Don excuses himself and says that he's got to take care of this note. And the next shot we see of Don is a very interesting choice, and it's something Mad Men have done before. They did it once in Season 1, Episode 3, just after we learnt that Don's other name is Dick Whitman, or his real name is Dick Whitman. The next shot that we see of Don is of his back, him walking into the office, and we see his back. With the camera sort of over his shoulder. And they do the same thing here. We've just learned that there's this man, Adam Whitman, at reception. The next shot of Don is of his back. It's that distance in effect again. It's suggesting that we don't know who Don is. Adam sees Don, and there's no doubt now that these two men obviously know each other. Don, being in the office, is uncomfortable and tells Adam to meet him down the road at a coffee shop. And at the coffee shop, it's a very poignant scene. We see Adam Whitman, just like he was in the office, he's very keen and he's very excited to finally have his older brother back, basically. And none of this is mirrored by Don, who's always stoic, serious, and doesn't reciprocate that excitement or that love. There is one line where Don does admit to having missed Adam, but as usual, Don doesn't say much in this scene. Interestingly, when Don brings up Abigail, who raised Don, he's very bitter. John Hamm's acting here is excellent. First of all, the writing is great as well. He doesn't call her mum, he says what happened to her. And when he learns that she died of stomach cancer, he says good. And he says it with brilliant expression. His face is amazing at this point. There's a lot of anger, just a lot of bitterness in Don here. He also doesn't care about Uncle Mac dying either. He really despises them. And back at the office, whilst Don is in this coffee shop with Adam, we see Betty and the kids coming into the office, which is a fantastic choice by the writers there, since the other storyline in this episode is about Liberty Capital Savings, for whom Sterling Cooper have just come up with this pitch to launch a new bank account that's for, as Paul Kinsey describes it, an account for a man that is private. And that is Donald Draper. Don is a very, very private man, of course. And in this scene where Betty's coming into the office, we see a little bit as to why he's private. Betty obviously doesn't know who Don is, neither does Peggy at this point. So seeing his family coming into the office during this very sensitive time for Don accentuates the fact that he's private and that this is his domestic life literally spilling into the office. He's almost caught here, because Peggy doesn't know where he's gone, doesn't know what to say. In fact, Peggy thinks he's with a woman, she thinks he's with Midge. Once again, drawing our attention to this fact that he's private. He is cheating on his wife, which is what Peggy thinks he's doing at that time. But he's also got this second level of privacy, of being a completely different man, of living a complete lie. Heartbreakingly so, Don, going back to the coffee shop, he tells Adam to basically leave him alone. He very cruelly leaves him here. And it's really sad because Adam just wants to have this relationship, and he's a very nice guy by all accounts. But Don explains that he has a life now, he has a family, and Adam would just complicate that. And so he very cruelly just leaves him there, leaves his brother. Later on in the episode, Don receives a note from Adam and a picture as well of the two when they were younger. And I think this kind of weighs on Don, because he does, towards the end of this episode, go and visit Adam at his hotel in room 5G. We see Don at home with Betty, and he tells her that he has to go back to the office. But just before Don leaves, we see him in his home office, in his study room in his house. And in an episode that is a lot about privacy, the pitch with Liberty Capital and whatnot, we see Don as the private man. He's in his office, which, as I mentioned in the episode Ladies' Room, that's the man's room in the house. We don't see Betty in that room. It's Don's room. And on top of that, even the drawers in that room are locked. And then they certainly are giving us some murder vibes here, because they show him opening this drawer with his key. They show him picking something up and putting it in his bag, but they don't show us what it is. And then we see Don very ominously walking through the hotel corridor where Adam stays, and he's wearing this long coat. He just looks like he is ready to kill someone. He goes into Adam's room, and the murder vibes continue as Adam turns his back to Don and starts making him a coffee. Don asks him, reminds the audience at this point by asking Adam, so Abigail's dead, Uncle Mac's dead, and Adam says, yeah, I've got nobody, basically. And that's to remind the audience that Adam could be killed, basically, by Don, and it's to amp up those murder vibes again. And as soon as Don says that, we see his hand going into his bag, and at this point, you're almost certain that he's gonna shoot Adam right now. But Adam turns around, they show Don once again, and it's revealed it's not a murder scene. He's not gonna shoot anybody. It's cash that he's got in his bag. But then we're left to wonder why. What's the point of all of these murder vibes if it's just money and not a gun in the bag at all? Well, my interpretation is that the money is, in a way, what kills Adam. It's not a gun in that bag, yes. But here's a man, Adam Whitman, who finally tracks down his old brother from a picture in the newspaper, after the Nuki Award, that is. And he reaches out to his brother. He wants love. He's obviously lonely. He's lost his parents. He's lost any contact with his family. And Don now, who is alive, unlike Uncle Mac and Abigail, refuses. He rejects his brother and gives him money instead. And eventually that is what the loneliness and the depression that Adam falls into is what eventually leads him to hang himself. And we know that Don has great guilt about this. The other storyline I want to talk about in this episode concerns Pete and Ken Cosgrove, and a little bit of Trudy Campbell as well. Early on in the episode, we see Ken announcing to various colleagues in the office that he's been published in a magazine, one of his short stories, I believe. And this makes Paul and Pete very jealous. And so Pete works on his own story. We see him in bed with Trudy, and she's just finishing reading his story. And he mentions here that she knows a man called Charlie Fiddich who has a big publishing job. And Pete asks if Trudy can meet with this man and get his story published, which is interesting because Trudy reveals that this is a man who she's had some history with, but Pete doesn't care. He cares that his story gets published. And the Trudy and Charlie Fiddich meeting is where things get interesting, because perhaps as expected, Charlie Fiddich is kind of sleazy and basically wants to sleep with Trudy, and she declines, rightfully so. She says, I'm married, and it would be wrong. And the next we see of this is in Pete and Trudy's apartment, where Pete, for a rare 10 or 20 seconds, is very happy when he's with his wife. As I've mentioned before, he's usually just miserable when he's with Trudy. But Trudy and Pete are celebrating, and he asks, so what magazine am I being published in? And she says, Boys Life magazine. And Pete is furious at this. He wants it to be a bigger magazine, a more reputable magazine. And Trudy sort of loses it here and says, if I wanted to, I could have gotten you in the New Yorker. Implying that if she had sex with Charlie Fiddich, she might have got him published in a bigger magazine. And Pete, who's one of my favorite characters, says one of his most unforgivable lines here, where he says, why didn't you? You know, why didn't you get me in a bigger magazine? If it meant sleeping with another man, so be it. Which reveals a lot about Pete in these early seasons. It's just a disgusting thing to say. All he wants is to impress other people, it seems, and all he wants is to get published in these magazines and make himself feel better, I guess, and he doesn't care at what cost that comes. This is really one of the worst things that Pete's ever said. He said some bad shit, but this being okay with his wife sleeping with another man to get him published, it reveals a lot about his ego, and it's just ugly. It's downright ugly. That is all I have to say for season 1 episode 5. Thank you for listening, and I hope you join me for next week's episode. You've been listening to Revisiting Madmen. Thank you very much.